Hi, I'm Leo Finelli, and you're listening to Generation Change. This month, Brianna Chandler is joining us. Brianna is a college student who lives and organizes in St. Louis, Missouri. Her areas of focus include abolition, climate justice, and, more holistically, Black liberation. She is a member of the River City Climate Collective and Washington University Students for Black and Palestinian Liberation. I spoke with Brianna about her various projects and experiences, how the demographics and politics of St. Louis factored into her motivation, and how we can turn a broken system around.
Hello,
Hello.
how are you?
Okay, how are you?
I'm all right. I'm making it.
So, you have said that the moment you started advocating was the moment you started existing. Why do you say that?
I think the moment that we start speaking up for ourselves is the moment that we truly begin to self-actualize because we're understanding and actively resisting the ways in which people have tried to tell us who we are instead of us telling the world who we are.
So, last month, with Molly Smith, we introduced a special new segment on our podcast that I have been calling Drop the Pin. It's a segment where we ask our guests on the podcast to share a little bit about the place where they grew up and how it impacted them as a person. And you are from St. Louis, Missouri.
Yes, yes, I am. Okay, so wow. So St. Louis is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And it has been interesting for me growing up having family that lives all over the place. In St. Louis, it's like I'll go to one address and zip code and it will be completely different in racial makeup and socioeconomic status. And then literally drive like a couple blocks and be in a different zip code that has a completely different racial makeup and a completely different socioeconomic status. And while this happens in all cities, it is so incredibly clear in St. Louis. There's something called the Del Mar Divide that has garnered national attention. In fact, when you Google Del Mar Divide, one of the first things that pops up is an article from the BBC. So they're even talking about these stark racial differences and socioeconomic differences in the UK. And I like to tell people that I think St. Louis is a microcosm for a lot of the overall systemic issues that the United States is facing. And of course, when I was 14 or 13, there was the murder of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising, and that definitely shaped the way I think about policing and the way I think about safety and all of that. And there are just so many incredible organizers in St. Louis that were here before Ferguson and are still here afterwards that I've been able to connect with and learn from, even during the summer of 2020 after the George Floyd murders and Ahmaud Arbery's murder. There were so many just marches of and actions of resistance happening in St. Louis. There's one in particular that I really, really care about and just am in awe of is a protest / occupation that took place outside of City Hall. The mayor at the time, Lyda Crewson, read a list of names and addresses of people on air for her like weekly Facebook Live. And those names and addresses she read were names of people who signed a petition to defund the police. And people who typically act in resistance to the police are Black and brown people. And so the fact that she would endanger these people's lives by reading their names on a live like Facebook segment was just incredibly infuriating. So this started an occupation outside of City Hall. I forget how long it lasted, definitely longer than a week. And the kind of tagline was "Resign, Lyda." So they had T-shirts, and it was just a beautiful display of solidarity with unhoused members of our community, and people from all different backgrounds coming to like take up space and kind of take back City Hall from a woman who was really like not representing the people. So those are some things about St. Louis that have definitely shaped me as a person.
So when did you start doing the Fridays Future Climate Strike?
Yeah, so this is only my second one that I'm participating in, and it really just depends on who in St. Louis is taking the initiative to organize them, and also COVID. So in my first year of college, I was kind of the action host for a climate strike. I did that as part of Sunrise. Sunrise is a national climate justice coalition full of young people. And we were a chapter called Sunrise St. Louis at the time. And so I served in that role as action host, and that was really interesting. Our theme was this is an emergency. So we all wore red to kind of signify, an emergency. And that was really great. And I stayed with Sunrise St. Louis for a very long time. And actually recently, the chapter that was formerly Sunrise St. Louis has rebirthed itself as the St. Louis River City Climate Collective, just because we felt that Sunrise National skew of being so heavily focused on legislation and politicians and not really on some of the more racial justice, economic justice, workers' justice values that they kind of espoused to hold. We wanted to create something that was localized and really felt like it was focusing on the things that were relevant to us as people in a city that has such racial injustice, such economic injustice. We also really wanted to talk about colonialism and Indigenous sovereignty, which is something that Sunrise National just has not been doing what it needs to do.
You've been covered by Rolling Stone magazine and in the New York Times. Do you feel like the media represented you, not people in your situation, but you specifically, honestly?
I think that sometimes the media, when people in the media come to you, they have a vision of what they want their story to be. And I think sometimes I didn't align with exactly the story they were looking for. And so I think maybe in the initial runs, I think it takes a minute for your authentic self to show up to the media, just because the media has a lens they're trying to view you through, and then you're also trying to hold up a lens to yourself as well. So I think it takes a minute to kind of remove that both lenses and really let your authentic self come through. I think that to an extent, yes, they definitely did represent my authentic self. It's always difficult when the media gets involved, because when the media gets involved, people kind of get these celebritizing glasses on, and they kind of can make you more or less than a real fallible human being. So I would say, yes, they represented my authentic self, but only parts of my authentic self, if that makes sense. I think the reason why people tend to put on these like celebritizing glasses when looking at people who are standing up against injustice, or people who are organizers, whatever you want to call them, is because it's easier for them to make someone else look perfect and to have someone else to lead, sometimes, instead of realizing that every individual person has the power to be just as impactful as the person they're putting up on a pedestal. And I think in times when the situation looks so bleak and hopeless, it's just easy to say, well, this person, these people over here are our hope, instead of looking inside oneself and saying, I am also that hope. When you're doing this kind of work, it's so easy to just compare yourself and say, well, I have to be like X, Y, and Z. And it's like, no, if you look back at history, there were millions and tons of people who had individual personalities and individual talents that made that movement great, that made it impactful. And so instead of, saying to yourself, I need to be like this person, and saying, I need to be who I am and show up authentically to this movement. Because when we show up authentically, we show up in the strongest way possible.
How do you combine and relate the different issues that you're involved with?
Yes. So I think it comes back to being aware of various systems of oppression. So being aware of capitalism that undergirds racial injustice, that undergirds climate justice, undergirds gender justice, all these different things. You can trace it back to capitalism. You can also, I think, also colonialism is another system that undergirds a lot of the issues and movements that I'm part of. So really taking it back to looking at root systems and how these root systems impact climate justice or gender justice or racial justice really helps us have a better understanding of how these movements can and should be connected.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. Hey, I just wanted to start out by saying thank you for listening to Generation Change with Leo Finelli. Ads like this help us produce this podcast. If you'd like to make your own podcast, try Anchor. It's free, it's easy to use, and it allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone, computer, or other digital device. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so that it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. Anchor helps you make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership needed. Anchor is everything you need to make a podcast, and it's all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today.
You're currently attending Washington University in St. Louis. What's it like? Do you feel comfortable there?
So I am very grateful for the opportunity to be a student at WashU. It's a top 20 university, great professors, and I love so many of the faculty and other students I've met there. So, and I do feel comfortable there. I've been lucky enough to meet peers who have the same interests as me, who have different interests than me. I've been able to connect with a lot of other Black students there that I've really, been able to find a community with.
If there's any way in which you don't feel comfortable there, what could Washington U be doing to make you more comfortable?
Ultimately, most educational institutions are just businesses. So there are a lot of things that I think are quote unquote wrong with WashU, but they're not any more wrong than they are at any other university. They have millions of dollars in budget money. And we have been saying to the university, hey, if you can just take some of those millions and put them towards getting more therapists for the mental health office, because the mental health of students on campus is abysmal, that would be great. We were making all these demands, and it wasn't just us. People were talking about these things. And at the end of last year, they released a report. And this report was the result of a student and faculty working group. And the thing that universities will do is they'll convene working groups or committees to look at things. And by the time the working group or committee has finished and they've released their report, people have moved on to the next thing, or movement leaders have graduated. And I know I'm kind of going in a lot of different places with this, but what I just shared is an example of how the university operates as a business, as a corporation, and how it doesn't always have its students' best interests at heart.
Yeah. So I also heard you were working on a TV show called School's Out. What's it about, and are you still making it?
So that was a very rudimentary project I was doing with my friend Claire, and it was just about our experience at our all-girls high school that we went to. And it was just kind of a passion project to help get us through the absolute dreariness of the beginning of quarantine. And my friend Claire still has very high aspirations for eventually going into television. I'm like, if you make it in the biz, then I'll circle back and we'll absolutely make that show. We joke that it combines Glee with The Politician in a way.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yes. And it's really just about the interesting culture that our specific all-girls school bred, and that it was very queer inclusive. It was feminist in a baseline way. It wasn't necessarily incredibly intersectional, but it did provide a lot of girls with introductions to feminism that they would take with them for the rest of their lives, and just what it looks like when you remove the influence of like cis het men from an environment, and what room that creates for queer people and girls to grow into themselves at a time when you're really searching for who you are.
Any other memorable specific stories from the last couple of years that you'd like to share?
So something that I felt incredibly grateful to be a part of was the movement against Line 3. So last June, the Anishinaabe peoples up in Minnesota, well, a tribe in Minnesota, invited people all across the nation to take part in their movement against a pipeline that was called Line 3. And it was specifically called the Treaty Peoples Gathering. And the idea was that treaties were not just made between Indigenous people and the United States government. Everyone who's a citizen of the US is a treaty person. We're all treaty people. We all have a responsibility to ensure that these treaties are upheld. And Pipeline 3 directly violated a treaty that the US government made with the Anishinaabe people. And they just invited us to come and hold space. We were given the option to shut down pipeline construction if we wanted to, knowing that it could potentially risk arrest. And I took part in that, and it was just really incredible to know that I was like a small, tiny part of a longer struggle for Indigenous sovereignty and climate justice. It was very meaningful for me to be there as a Black person as well, just because historically Black people have not been able to fully engage with the environmentalist movement, and to really, for myself, personally reflect on the history of Black and Indigenous solidarity. And so I'm very grateful to just have had that experience. I was arrested, I did go to jail, but that was just nothing in comparison to what other people have sacrificed.
You did go to jail.
In the movement. I did go to jail, yes. Still working out my court stuff. And like my arrest, and even the arrest of, the grandmas and the grandpas within the movement, is just nothing compared to how the state has repressed Indigenous struggles and its colonial violence against Indigenous nations.
So what do we do to turn this around?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Line 3 was completed, I believe, last September, and that was very sad. But I do think that it was a large display of force by the people to show the next time you want to lay down or reconstruct a pipeline, we will be there to resist it. And go protest, do things, even if it will risk arrest. Because the only way we're going to be able to get us out of the climate crisis mess is to show the government that we are serious about putting an end to environmental degradation.
And what is your vision for an unenvironmentally degraded world?
I'd say Indigenous sovereignty is absolutely a part of that world. I'll say dismantling capitalism is part of that world. And I think that world includes homes for all. And I think it involves racial justice and gender justice, and a lot of really uncomfortable conversations. A world with authenticity as well, right? Not doing things because it looks good, doing things because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, and only applying what serves practical purpose and is not just pointless excess.
Right, absolutely. Intentionality, very important.
Yeah. When do you graduate from college?
So if all goes according to plan, I'll graduate in May of 2024 with my master's of social work and on my way to being a therapist. So,
would you say that your view of the future is overall hopeful and optimistic, even with everything in your way?
Yes, I would say so. And I don't know if I'm going to see the future that I'm hoping for, but I believe that my grandchildren will.
Okay, thank you so much for being on this podcast today, Brianna. It was so nice talking to you.
It was nice to meet you as well.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm still processing some of the things Brianna and I talked about. The facts are still settling over me. She was arrested, and if the police who arrested her were trying to defend property, why aren't they defending the land, which is a property of the Anishinaabe people, from the construction of a pipeline? It was encouraging to hear Brianna say, at the end, that she's hopeful and optimistic about the future. After I recorded the interview, I was wondering what I could do. I thought a lot about it, and I thought that maybe I and we could begin by ignoring the tempting voices in our heads that are telling us that if we want something and we can afford it, we deserve it. This might be hard to accept, but I hope as Gen Z comes of age, our understanding of centuries-long injustice will be reflected in the ways in which we spend our money and spend our time and interact with the world around us. You can follow Brianna on Twitter and Instagram at _Bri, BRI _Chandler _. If you'd like to recommend someone you know who is trying to make a difference to be on the show, or if you are someone trying to make a difference and would like to be on the show, email us at generationchange@leofinelli.com. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at GenChangeWithLF. That's at GenChangeWithLF. Follow and review wherever you get your podcasts, and just share this with your friends and others. Generation Change with Leo Finelli is hosted by Leo Finelli, executive produced by Julie Finelli, and edited by Nick and Leo Finelli. Our original music was composed and performed by Leo Finelli. Thank you so much for listening.